From battlefield to bomb shelter, from home front to hospital, from volunteer rosters to victims lists, women experience war in distinctive, gendered ways. These are their stories. These are their voices. Welcome to Voices of Women at Wartime, a podcast by the Center for Women's Justice in Israel. I'm Rivkah Lubitch. My co-host Rachel Stomel is not here today. As I mentioned last episode already, Rachel is on maternity leave with her baby twin girls. Today I'm with Dr. Susan Weiss. Susan is the founder and the director of the Center for Women's Justice, so she's my boss, and we've been working together for many years. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Rivkah. I'm honored to be here with you today, as it has been my honor and privilege to work with you for so many years.
Oh, thank you so much for that. The honor is mine. So you've been involved with this podcast from its inception, but this is the first time that you're on air. So that's pretty exciting for me.
Yes. And today we want our listeners to know that we're doing something a little different. Until now, we've been interviewing women outside the Center for Women's Justice who've been doing all kinds of unique and important things in response to the war with Gaza. Today, I want to interview you, Rivkah, about the impact the war may have had on women as a result of religious laws, halitzah. You, as we all know, I think, are a rabbanit, a rabbinic pleader, and have been advocating for many years for women in the rabbinic courts. You've been involved with cases of agunot, women who cannot get divorced under Jewish law because their husbands are missing, incompetent, or simply refusing to deliver or get a Jewish bill of divorce. You've worked with women who have children who are stigmatized as mamzerim because they were born of kinship relations that are prohibited under the laws of Leviticus. And you've worked with women who need to undergo the ritual of halitzah, a type of divorce from their brothers-in-law because their husbands have died without living offspring. You have a lot of halachic knowledge. And as I understand, you will be talking about the war and its impact on those matters and more.
Okay, so let's dive into it. So we're going to look at three main issues today. The first and main problem would be agunot. So a classic agunah is a woman that was married according to Jewish law and does not know where her husband is. We pretty much know that he's dead, but it can't be proven. So right now, we're mainly talking about soldiers that were killed in the war, but we don't actually have a body. The wife would then become an agunah, chained, literally, and never be allowed to remarry. That is the situation. Even if we know that the body is completely burnt, if we don't have any proof that that was the person, then she becomes an agunah.
And this is not the first time in history, if I'm correct, right?
No. In every major tragedy where people die or there's a war, there are women stuck in this situation. So after the Holocaust, there were loads of women that were agunot. After the First World War, the Second World War, any pogrom, the 9/11 situation, there are always women that are married and they know that their husbands are dead, but because there's no body, they're stuck as agunot. So in this war, the problem of agunot would be mainly in reference to the wives of the soldiers. But God forbid, if the married men in captivity aren't released, and this goes on, God forbid, I don't even want to think of it, but if this does happen, if it goes on for years, then these wives will become agunot because their husbands either will think that they're dead or they're alive and they can't physically send a bill of divorce to these women. So they won't be allowed to remarry. So in the past, we had great rabbis as Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Ovadia Yosef that were thought of as pillars of the Jewish community, and they did a lot of work to unchain the agunot. I don't know who it's going to be today that is going to be working on it. By the way, I don't know if I want to explain this, but there is this mythical idea that there's something called hatarat agunot, where you just bring the agunah in and you do some magical procedure and get her undone. I actually heard somebody in the news asking a very learned woman the other day, how do they do hatarat agunot? And she never really explained that there is no such thing as hatarat agunot. Some agunot get undone and some don't.
So there's no general systemic solution, no waving of any magic wand that you can do to just free women?
There's no waving of a magic wand. In some cases, they do say that, maybe all the people that were in that building, we know that were something, but usually it's really done case by case. It takes years to resolve. Not all the cases get resolved. And even though the rabbanut did announce that there is a special beit din that they're creating for this, there will not be a general, as far as I can guess, there will not be a general solution. Like everybody that was there is considered dead or something like that.
But Rivkah, doesn't Jewish law allow a woman to appoint an agent to give a get, a bill of divorce, instead of himself? Can't he appoint a rabbi or another man to give a get to his wife? He can give a get, and then I've heard of the get being given on condition. That is to say, give a get that will only go into effect if a man does not return from war or is missing.
Okay, so that's a very complicated question. I just want to say that, first of all, most women that come to get divorced, they are absolutely sure that the rabbis can give them the get instead of the husband. So they keep saying, so what if he doesn't give me a get? Why aren't they releasing me? And the answer is, in general, the big answer is no, they can't. The husband can appoint an agent to give the get, but not if he's dead or missing. He has to do that when he wants to appoint the person to be an agent. So it is actually too late in the game once the husband is dead or missing. So the only way to solve that issue would be if you appointed the agent in advance. So that means that either before you get married as a condition on the marriage or before you go out to war. Now, that is not so simple. First of all, you'd have to get the rabbis to agree that this agent who is appointed in advance, that this holds halachically. The main problem there would be that you can't really appoint an agent when you're not planning on getting divorced. And obviously, if you're just getting married or you're just going to war, you're not really planning on getting divorced. So you'd have to get around that issue as, how am I appointing an agent when I don't really want to get divorced right now? That would be the one problem.
Didn't King David do that before men went to war? Didn't he? That's what they say was done, right? And didn't?
Yeah, well, that's really something else, because there they actually did give a get on condition, and then they said, if I don't come back, this get holds. So that was really something completely different, and nobody really does that today. So the other problem would be that not only do you have to get rabbis to agree halachically that it holds, you actually have to get the husbands to do it, to want to do something like that. And not everybody wants to sign something that says, I'm appointing an agent to go and give a get for me if I'm not around to give the get. So those are the two things that are problematic. In fact, the Center for Women's Justice has two types of documents. One is a conditional marriage, a shtar hatzna'ah, where the husband says, as he's getting married, that under certain circumstances the marriage would be void, or that an agent can give a get instead of him. We also published a different document, the idea coming from attorney Nitzan Kaspi Shiloni, and having it being done together with Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig, who looked into the halachic issues around it and gave his hechsher to it. And in that document, the husband, at some point within the marriage, signs that under certain circumstances, an agent would be able to give the wife a get instead of him. And that is called a shtar bitachon. And that is what one can sign at some point within the marriage or before you go to war.
Has the Israeli rabbinate recognized these prenups and postnups that we've recommended?
Right. So the Israeli rabbinate is actually against all those things, and they don't recognize it. We're hoping that in any serious cases of agunot, the rabbinate will actually recognize it, but we certainly have some liberal Orthodox rabbis that would recognize it. Not that that means anything, because they are not the ones that do the weddings afterwards. But, we're trying to do educational work also in our organization. So we're trying to bring it up, get people to sign it, and get the rabbanut to understand that this is needed.
So to sum things up, we're worried about women whose husbands might be missing or incapacitated as a result of this war and won't be able to give their wives a get.
Right. We're very, very worried about that. And everyone else is worried about it. I know that religious people think of that as the first thing that religious people think of. And everyone is occupied with that idea, besides all the other problems that we have in the war.
Okay, so we have agunot, and then we have the problem of halitzah, right? That was the second issue you wanted to discuss.
Right. So the second issue is halitzah, and as you mentioned before, it's a ritual that has to be done if a married man dies and did not leave any offspring. In order for his wife to be able to get married again, Jewish law requires that she go through a procedure where the brother of her husband, the brother of the dead husband, releases her from any legal obligation that she had to actually marry him. Just a few days ago, I don't know if I sent this to you, Susan, but the rabbanut actually announced, having not to do anything with the war, they announced that there's a very problematic case in Petach Tikva, where the father of the deceased won't allow the younger son to do halitzah and to release the wife unless the widow agrees to some crazy conditions like giving up all the inheritance, etc., etc.
I actually think there was a famous Israeli movie about a woman whose husband died and he had a brother, but the brother was underage, and the brother was 8 years old. And then she had to wait many years until he had the capacity, or he was even younger than that, to actually do the halitzah ceremony. It's something that I know when I got married, I never thought of the possibility that such a thing could happen. And my husband had two brothers. Anyway, yes.
Well, I thought of it at the time. I was very, very aware of it. And there are a lot of tragedies that can happen here. As you said, the brother can be a young kid, or he can disappear, or not agree to do it. The parents can step in. We know all kinds of stories. We personally know a story of someone who had trouble getting halitzah, and it's an awful thing.
What happens if the brother's incapacitated? In other words, what happens if there's a brother, but he doesn't have the mental capacity to get? What happens under those?
Then she may be stuck forever. She won't be allowed to remarry. By the way, the children won't be mamzerim from halitzah. If you do not have halitzah, but you should have halitzah, the rabbinit won't marry you. But if you do get married or get together with someone and have children, they won't be mamzerim.
Rivkah, if I remember correctly, doesn't Jewish law allow for conditional marriages to avoid the problem of halitzah? Because if I remember correctly, during the Enlightenment, a lot of Jewish men converted to Christianity. And in response, the women didn't want to marry the men whose brothers had converted because they were worried that if they needed halitzah, the man who had converted to Christianity would never agree to undergo such a religious Jewish ceremony.
I don't think that was solved by saying that the marriage was conditional. I think that was just solved by saying that they don't need halitzah. Because basically, if the rabbis say, well, this situation, you don't need halitzah, then she doesn't need halitzah. So I think that's the way it was solved. But that was the only thing that was, kind of like there was a big solution to it, because there was a time when a lot of men were going off to become communists, Christians, and were disappearing and wouldn't play the game of coming back and doing this not fun ritual of having the woman spit in front of you. We're not really going to get into it today. I want to say, Susan, I want to tell our listeners that you and I are planning on having a series actually of episodes where we're going to talk about all the things that Center for Women's Justice has done and all the different issues, and then we will really spell things out clearer. So today we're kind of just hinting at things.
And tell me, do you know the official position of the Israeli rabbinate with respect to halitzah? Do they have a systemic solution in mind for that?
I don't think that there's a systemic solution. Obviously, there are a lot of women in this war that are going to need halitzah, because halitzah is basically an issue for young couples when you don't have children, because after a few years, usually people have children, so then it's not a problem. You don't need to have halitzah. But I know that there's a lot of talk about it already. The rabbanut is aware of it, and there are a lot of young women whose husbands have died and they do not have children, and they're going to need halitzah. I'm sure that the rabbanut is going to make things easier for them to do, and they're going to have some special team that will be on it, but it's going to be a case-by-case thing.
Okay, so we've dealt with agunot and halitzah. We're coming to something that is very sensitive, and I'm not sure many people have thought about it, and that's the issue of Rivkah?
Okay, maybe our listeners should stop here and not listen to the rest, because we have a whole bunch of people that told us, don't do it, don't talk about it, don't mention it. And I don't think anybody before has mentioned it, even though I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about it. But we've decided to bring it up anyway. So the third issue would be, what happens about women who have been raped? What are the consequences for these women?
Halachic consequences.
Halachic consequences. Well, we know that the other psychological, mental, physical consequences are really, really, really bad.
Yeah.
We're not going into that
and
one.
We probably
here.
don't need these halachic consequences on top of
added to them. We're going to mention, again, disclaimer, we don't know what's going to happen really, and we don't know what the rabbanut is going to say, and if there's going to be any big solution to this or case by case. We're just bringing up the problems. So what are the consequences for women that were raped? So first, we're going to have to differentiate between married women and non-married women. Non-married women, less of a problem. Married women, more of a problem. Again, this is according to strict halakha. This doesn't mean that the rabbis won't find ways to avoid or bypass all these issues. So according to halakha, any married woman in general who had a consensual sexual relations with a man who is not her husband is not allowed to go back to her husband and continue living with him. If she's raped, she is allowed. Okay, but if she's married to a kohen, she's not allowed in any case, neither in the case of rape or in the case of consensual relations. Now, having said that, rabbis assume that in captivity, a woman is raped, meaning not being allowed to a husband who is a kohen. And then some rabbis would say that captivity is thought of as not being rape, but having consent sexual relations.
Why would they consider that consent, Rivkah?
It's terrible, because what some rabbis say, it's actually the Ashkenazi rabbis that say that she actually agreed to it because she wants to get something, she wasn't really raped with a gun. She just did it because she wants to get something out of the person who's...
Like life?
Yeah, because she understands. It's just a different definition of what rape is. So they're saying, rape is only when you actually have a gun, but if you were doing it because you wanted to get something out of the...
You wanted to make sure the terrorists didn't kill you.
Right. The person who took you into captivity doesn't kill you, so you're doing it because you wanted to do it and not because you were raped. So that's pretty awful. Those people who would say that all the women who are married cannot go back to live with their husbands. But the truth is, in a lot of things in Jewish halakha, things can go both ways because, once things get really, really, really bad, then they suddenly switch to the other side and say, well, we won't know if they were raped. How can you prove that they were raped? We don't have anybody there that saw them actually, that they were raping the women. Because we don't know, then suddenly everyone will be okay, even the women that are married to Kohanim. And there was a case at some point in halakha where they actually said that they're voiding all the marriages because of those women who were in captivity. Because as we know, the rabbis do have the ability to annul marriages by saying adata d'Rabbanan kidshu, so we can void the marriages. So therefore, it wouldn't be a problem.
Let me understand, Rivkah. Let me try and recap in a way. So this means that according to some rabbis, any married woman who has been held in captivity may be prohibited under religious laws from resuming her relation with her husband, whether or not she is married to a Kohen, right? So some are taking strict position that if she was in captivity, she can't go back to her husband.
Right. A middle option would be that only those who are married to Kohanim can't go back to her husband. And the other thing would be that we're voiding all the marriages and we have no proof. And you know what? Somebody may say this captivity wasn't a regular captivity. It was something else. It was some other word for it. And it doesn't come under that definition of captivity.
But we don't know what the official position of the Israeli rabbanit is on these matters. Am I correct?
Yeah, but I still have one more thing to say because all that had to do with married women.
But one minute. I want to ask you something about the married women. And if a married woman became pregnant in captivity, would her child be considered a mamzer?
No. There are no issue of mamzerim in this whole thing. The only issue of mamzerim would be if a woman, when we started, with the issue of agunot, where we said that there are women who are agunot, and then they don't listen to the rabbanut, and they have sexual relations and have children, then the rabbanut can come and say that these children are mamzerim.
Why is a child born as a result of sexual relations in this type of situation, God forbid?
Because he's not Jewish.
Okay. That's the law?
That's the answer. That's the law. That there are no mamzerim with non-Jews.
Okay.
And mamzerut begoy.
Okay, so till now you've spoken about women who are married. And what about the women who are not married?
Okay, so women who are not married in general, if you have sexual relations with a non-Jew, then you can't marry a Kohen. So that would be, if rabbis are assuming that all the women who are in captivity are raped, and we're assuming that the Hamas are all non-Jews, then they wouldn't be able to marry a Kohen. Now, somebody could come and say, we don't know if they were raped, there's no proof that they were raped, etc., and that we don't know if the Kohen is a Kohen. But basically, the bottom line would be that they aren't looking for these things. And these women, there's no point probably that the rabbanut would ask a person, have you been in captivity? There's no actual question like that. When you go to get married, there would be no issue where the registrar would say, have you, by the way, been in captivity? Or have you had sexual relations with a non-Jew? But by the way, if this comes up, if a woman goes to the rabbanut and says, I had a boyfriend and his name was so-and-so, and it sounds to them like it's a Russian name, and they suspect that he wasn't Jewish, and they ask her, was he Jewish? Then they won't allow her to marry a Kohen. But that has nothing to do with the war. All this last thing that I just said isn't really going to be a problem for many women unless they're religious and they look into it and they say, oh my God, I am not allowed to do this, because the rabbanut isn't going to pick up on it at any point. But if people decide to become religious, chozrim b'tshuva, or they are religious, then they may be bothered by all these things. And it's not really good.
Okay, Rivkah, now let's get down to the real issues here.
It's way too late.
Now I want to raise this real issue. And let's agree that these are not good laws. These are bad laws.
We can agree on that. And as I said, we're going to have a series of episodes where we'll talk about it in more depth. But if you want me to say that, I will say it.
No. I would like you just to give your initial response. How do you feel about these laws as a religious feminist?
I am very unhappy with these laws, and I think there should be a general way of overcoming it and not saying case by case. Even if we have a general way of overcoming it, I won't be happy, because I'll always have to look back and say these laws weren't good. But I think that the only way to get around all these things together is to say that we have a different way of getting married, which is not Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. It's without kinyan. It'll be a religious way of getting married, but it won't be the way it used to be. We'll change the whole way, and that will solve all the halachic problems.
And what about the fact that Israel has adopted these laws as the law of the land? What do you feel about that?
Okay, I can ask you on that one. Okay, Susan, what you asked me is the question that you're getting now.
Well, what I'm trying to incorporate into the understanding of the Center for Women's Justice for many, many years is that these laws are religious laws, and people should be free to believe and obey these religious laws, but they should not be imposed by any Western democratic government on its citizens. So I, for one, for sure, think there has to be separation of church and state in Israel. And I think, I don't know, you can tell me if this is true, that I have convinced the people who have had I'm not sure it's privilege of working with me, or have had the burden of working with me, but have come to
yes,
with that position.
You've convinced us all.
Okay. Anyway, more to come.
More to come. Thank you so much, Susan, for being with me today on the CWJ's podcast, Voices of Women at Wartime. Stay tuned for more discussions that the two of us are planning on having. I would also like to recommend listening to Hannah Wacholder Katzman being interviewed on a podcast called Exit Strategy, put out by Plaza Jewish Community Chapel in New York City. Hannah was interviewed concerning the death of her son Chaim Yeshurun Katzman Zal, who was killed on October 7th at his home in Kibbutz Cholit. We'll put up a link for that. Rachel and I actually spoke with Hannah on this topic on the first episode of this podcast.
I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. By listening to this podcast and giving women's voices your attention, you give them power. If you, like us, agree that women's perspectives are essential to the Israeli narrative, please subscribe to the Voices of Women at Wartime from the Center for Women's Justice, wherever you get your podcasts, and encourage your friends to listen and subscribe too. If you have thoughts, questions, or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media, on the Center for Women's Justice page on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or wherever.
Thank you, Rabbi Scott Kahn, for the recording and editing. I am Rivkah Lubitch, and I was here today with Susan Weiss. Be well and stay safe.